Yay! Welcome. See a few people joining us. I'm not sure if your evening was like mine, but I just spent some time trying to wrap up dinner very quickly and do dishes and get children to bed. And so this is a nice little moment to take a breath before we begin, but it'll be such a nice time today. We'll wait another second or so and then get started. All right. I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this evening for a women and for our Women Are Resilient speaker series. This is the second in the series, 2 more to come. I know it can be difficult to be on our screens again after a long day. I definitely feel that, but we hope this will be a space of refreshment and encouragement for you tonight. We're just so grateful for another opportunity to learn and grow together as a community. We really count this as a gift. Before I introduce our speaker today, just a couple administrative items to note for the security of our presentation and to keep our planned time for tonight. We've disabled the audio and the video options for all the attendees, but you can chat with a Treetop staff member using the chat feature if you have any questions or comments or a question for our speaker tonight throughout the presentation, you can put them there. SaraJane Herrboldt is the founder of Rising Resilient. With more than a decade of work in the school system supporting students, educators, and parents, the impact of trauma became a familiar and frequent visitor. She quickly realized that in order to have a greater impact on the collective, we must first start with ourselves. This drives her passion for promoting the well-being of others and creating opportunities to build upon resilience. Through coaching and professional development, she strives to create environments where individuals can be more curious, compassionate, and resilient beings. Her book, Don't Just Survive, Thrive, was released on March 2nd, just a couple weeks ago, and offers sustainable options beyond burnout through a collection of practices. Originally from the snowy mountains of Wyoming, she made her way to West Michigan and shares life with her partner and their 3 greatest teachers, their children. And I'm just so excited on a personal note to have SaraJane here tonight. She is an inspiration to me as a fellow adoptee mama, but also someone who has developed practices that keep her grounded in the midst of a lot of work in the community and just utilizing her passions in hard places. And so I'm just thrilled that we get the chance to hear from her tonight. So with that, welcome, SaraJane.
Thank you, Tara. Well, I do want to begin by just saying thank you to Tara and to Abby and to the rest of the Treetops collective team for inviting me to be a part of this series. Also, I want to thank each of you for choosing to show up on a Monday after a long day and to spend some time with us this evening. So I'm truly humbled and honored to have received the opportunity to sit with each of you tonight, especially because I know there's no shortage of resilient stories that are waiting to be told. In fact, I'm confident that each one of us here tonight could think of numerous individuals who are resilient and whose stories deserve to be told here. So with that in mind, I feel very honored and privileged to be with you all this evening. So thank you again. As Tara mentioned, my name is SaraJane, and I'm going to share a little bit of my story with you this evening that led to work that I feel very passionate about. My personal family story is one where we have encountered a lot of twists and turns, ups and downs, and bumps and bruises. And while oftentimes many of the details of our story can go unnoticed, they play a significant part in who I am, who my family is, and how I show up in the world. So about 4.5 years ago, my family moved from the snowy mountains of Wyoming, where I had spent my entire life in the Rocky Mountains, to West Michigan. And though we felt that this was a move meant to happen, this was also a move that was a big change for us, one that really stretched us. It created a lot of disruption and a lot of change. And there were a multitude of moments that felt very full of uncertainty and the unfamiliar. I'm curious if any of you over the past year have encountered a lot of disruption or change, right? We as a collective have encountered this shared experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that disruption and change and uncertainty can be activating, even triggering, especially if there is stress or trauma that has been lying dormant. So these moments full of disruption, full of chaos, full of change, full of uncertainty can increase our stress levels, and they can demand a lot of us as individuals and even communities to start to move in different ways than we are often familiar. So my family moved and we encountered a lot of that disruption, a lot of that change. And we, quite honestly, were in unfamiliar territory. I often thought this meant people wanted to high five me, and it was a very friendly community. We were working hard to make this transition and this change to new territory feel like home and to support our children along the way. And as Tara mentioned, my children are children who also happen to be adopted. So I would say to you that, quite honestly, that at the time, we didn't really know how to move differently with ease. We were falling into patterns and rhythms and routines that actually felt quite familiar just to create some sense of comfort. But these patterns and these rhythms and these routines weren't necessarily the most helpful ways for us to be approaching our stress. So, all of this is occurring in my personal life. And then there was everything occurring in my professional life. So, as some say, when it rains, it pours. And I experienced that in both aspects of my life, personally and professionally. You know, I began my career as an educator and being the first person in my family to graduate from college. I prided myself on working really hard in my career, making sure that I never did the bare minimum, that I always went above and beyond. I had high hopes of making a difference among my students, with their families, even within my community. And I also really longed to help each of my students thrive in the world. And so at the time when we moved, I felt like I had been doing this somewhat successfully for over 10 years. But unfortunately, a lot of that shifted for me as I continued my career in my new community. Within the first year, I was pulled from my position to help not one, but two individuals who were encountering family and medical emergencies. And as any good human wanting to help would do, I stepped into it because I wanted to help. Suddenly, the demands of the job were overwhelming and incredibly stressful, all while I was still trying to equate myself with my new surroundings. I returned the following year thinking it only could get better from here. The only way forward is up. However, within the first 6 weeks of school, I actually encountered three different individuals who would have to take a step back or even step away from their career due to the stress and demands of the job being so overwhelming. These were people who were working really hard to do the good, important, hard work of educating. And they were experiencing a lot of pain. And people around them were also experiencing a lot of pain. The struggle seemed more constant than not. And so, never being one to accept the status quo, I started getting really curious and paying attention. So, stress is not unfamiliar to me. In fact, I could boldly say that I think stress is something we all encounter. Each of us has encountered a struggle, a stress, or perhaps even a trauma during our lifetime. Again, a year ago, quite suddenly, we all found ourselves thrown into a pandemic that disrupted our routines, blurred the lines between home and work boundaries, forced us to learn and embrace technology in new ways. And change seems to be about the only constant we've experienced as days turn into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months now have led up to a 1 year anniversary. I don't know about you, but I'm assuming many of us feel as though we spent the last year doing a lot of surviving, perhaps barely keeping our head above the water. And while I imagine very few of us anticipated all that we would be asked to navigate, or that we would even still be in the midst of a pandemic, moving through continued changes, here we are. So, how we navigate stress is really impacted by the way in which we view our stress. And I started to take a deep dive into learning this firsthand. The degree of stress we experience, the way in which we carry that stress, how it even shows up within our bodies, really is dependent on a lot of things. And some forms of stress at times can be helpful. Think back to caveman living, right? We had this stress response of fight or flight to survive, to make it from day to day. So while there is a good part of stress because it can activate our adrenaline or get our cortisol pumping, it gets us moving into action to try harder or to meet deadlines. It can be also focused on what we use to primarily deal with short-term problems, not frequent, ongoing, long-term problems. And so as our stress load increases, our energy can become depleted, and we may begin to feel as though things are unmanageable even more quickly than before. And this long term continual impact of stress starts to take its toll. The ongoing activation of a stress response means that our body is continually exposed to adrenaline and cortisol. And this constant exposure leads to what might be considered as chronic stress. And in my learning, I realized that chronic stress puts your health at greater risk, and it makes you more susceptible for experiencing compassion fatigue and burnout. And all of these were things that I was witnessing play out within my work life, and at times, quite honestly, even within my home. This constant, persistent encounter with symptoms of stress, overwhelm, fatigue, depression, anxiety, frustration, apathy really started to be an indicator to me of individuals experiencing burnout and shifting into a state that was having negative effects on not only the individual, but the collective as a whole. So, yes, stress is something we will all encounter throughout our lifetime. So, now what? Well, and that's when I began to realize that while stress will be there, so is resilience. So, what does it mean to be resilient? This is a word that I had heard thrown around, but couldn't quite find a definition that felt like it encompassed what I had been learning. I would even ask you to consider how you would define resilience. Some refer to resilience as this ability to quickly bounce back and to return to a state of normalcy. And while I think there is some truth to that, I think that can sometimes shift us into thinking that then resilience is defined as being someone who is absent of pain, struggle, or even hardship. And again, I was an individual who was surrounded by pain and struggle and hardship. So I started to question if this definition really worked or if I just wasn't finding resilient human beings in my midst. I don't think that resilience is an absence of pain, struggle, or hardship. I think it can be demonstrated when we can keep going and we can persevere, especially during difficult circumstances. But I do not think that resilience means we push ourselves through unbearable pain in order to persevere in any circumstance, regardless of the situation. When we view resilience in this manner, we can set ourselves up for feeling trapped, hopeless, and helpless. And again, I think I was finding individuals who felt trapped, hopeless, and helpless. And when we hold ourselves or others to these unrealistic expectations and even standards, if we think a resilient individual is one who never steps away, never gives up, never gets overwhelmed by stress or trauma, I think we're creating some difficulty for ourselves. I quickly learned that I can't build my resilience, my capacity for resilience, or even that of any other human being that I care deeply for, if I wasn't also willing to acknowledge my stress and trauma and the stress and trauma that others were encountering along the way. I recognized that how I nurtured and approached my stress really impacted how I nurtured and approached my resilience, and vice versa. So again, as I said, when we when we approach resilience with this keep going no matter what mindset, we set ourselves up for a lack of compassion and a lack of support. And we can't simply always do it all. We need to remind ourselves that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to take a break along the way, especially when dealing with difficult things, so that we can keep coming back. We can keep returning to the work we believe in, to the people we love and care for. But we have to first be brave enough to acknowledge our own humanity and start from there. So here is the good news that I believe to be true, because I have found it to be true within my own personal life and the lives of many others that I have sat with. Resilience is accessible to everyone. It's something that resides within all of us. And how we define resilience really impacts how we cultivate it. So, when I can define resilience as compassionate, aware practices that allow for me to nurture myself and care better for those that I'm sharing life with, I start to practice and carry out resilience tendencies on a daily basis. How we cultivate our resilience really helps us move through and cope with setbacks, with obstacles, with barriers, and build our a capacity to continue to deal with the stress that we are going to continue to encounter. I was getting uh, firsthand knowledge of trying this on, living this out. And I started to share that experience with those around me and see that it had a very similar impact on the people that I care deeply for in my home and within my workplace. And I noticed that resilience actually helps us thrive even in the midst of struggle, even in the midst of constant change and disruption and uncertainty. And practicing resilience is not necessarily always easy, nor will it always allow you to control every circumstance you encounter, but it does help you determine how you approach each circumstance and challenge and how you move forward and through. So, from my personal and professional lived experience, I recognize that to be a resilient human, we have to take on this posture of curiosity. We have to take on a posture of listening to ourselves and to those around us. And then we have to acknowledge what it is that we're noticing, whether that's emotions that rise up or feelings of overwhelm or even physical sensations within the body. And then from our acknowledgement, we should pursue this compassionate action so that we know when to reprioritize and shift how we're moving. Perhaps even knowing when we need to choose ourselves first so we can respond differently to those around us. It means knowing you have limits and taking care of yourself so you can care for others. And I was functioning in a mentality and mindset of very much wanting to do it all and help be all for those that were around me, not recognizing that this very mindset and approach was actually limiting in how I showed up for those around me. So, where does one begin to cultivate resilience, to deepen our capacity? I think it begins with building awareness, especially self awareness, by paying attention, by noticing how we navigate not just the external world, but the internal as well. And if we are unaware of how we feel in a given moment, in a particular state of being, then it becomes more challenging for us to properly respond to get to the very things we need to thrive and to meet the needs of those around us so they too can thrive. I think resilience also begins by caring for ourselves and remembering to meet our basic needs. When we can meet our basic needs, then we are able to better respond with care, right? Self care is knowing who you are and how you are. And that's a little bit of a shift from how we may have viewed care in the past. And finally, I think resiliency happens to be cultivated when we can connect our mind and our body, our whole being, right? The mind and the body are intricately connected, and to care for one allows for us to better care for the other. So when we give ourselves time and space, whether through quiet time or meditation or movement or a practice that allows for us to notice how we're breathing and what's going on the inside, we also simultaneously give ourselves a choice to notice and to choose how we want to respond by continuing on or choosing to do something differently. So, in my career, that I was so determined to show up and be incredibly successful in, recognized that in order for me to be the most supportive partner, the most supportive mother, the most supportive friend, I actually had to start stepping back from the things that I really identified with, that I took a lot of pride in. And I had to start choosing to respond in a different way so that no matter what the stress or uncertainty of the day to day brought, I could be more present and more loving and more compassionate for the people around me. And all of this really made sense to me, not only with my family, but with the students I was working with the colleagues I shared my Mondays through Fridays with. And so I became very passionate about sharing this information with individuals. And I've sat with many individuals through the years, especially over this past year. And I continually long to find the exact right words to offer each person so they feel seen and heard and cared for, so that their complexity of joy and heaviness that they are navigating is acknowledged. And much like I would say to them, I want to offer to each of you this evening that, again, we all encounter stress, right? Whatever the struggle or the suffering or the pain you are encountering, that it doesn't have to go unnoticed. That it is important for us to acknowledge that we all face struggles and hardships throughout our lifetime. And the very presence of this does not mean that you are doing something wrong. Rather, it means that you are a human being and you have limits. So I often recognize that hope is what carries us through. So if I were to leave you with anything this evening, I would say to remember that how you approach and cultivate your resilience as an individual is really going to impact how you approach and process and navigate your stress, and to not lose hope. Resilience resides within all of us, and each one of us can learn to become even more resilient no matter what our circumstances are at any point in time in our life, so that we can thrive and not just survive in the day to day. I am very grateful for each of you being here and taking the time to hear a little bit of my experience. And I hope that you found some sense of encouragement within the reminder that you're not alone in the encounter of stress and struggle and trauma, um, and that you leave remembering that you are just as resilient as the person sitting next to you, or across the room for you, or even across the screen from you. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Oh, my soul is feeling very cared for right now. So thank you. We do have a couple questions, so I just want to close with that before we, head out for the evening. The first one is, what practices have you developed to acknowledge small joys or wins in any given day or week?
That's a great question. Small joys or wins. It has to be daily. I would love to say that I can get through a week and I can recall what happens on Monday, but I think as many of us have found ourselves in kind of this perpetual Groundhog's Day rhythm, it's really important to incorporate a consistent, regular practice of noticing and paying attention. So something that I love to do is, whether I'm snapping a photo on my phone or an encounter, is just at the end of each day, kind of taking a moment to reflect and recall what has happened, that sparked a moment of joy. And joy, can feel a little differently for all of us. But that feeling of joy is really connected to building resilience. So somewhat of, some people might use like a daily gratitude practice, and that could be a very similar approach to recalling those moments that brought you joy or helped you feel strong, or helped you feel even resilient. So for me, it's often journaling, reminding myself through a reflection of photos or text messages, or just even in encounters that I've had with individuals throughout the day, what really stood out to me as meaningful.
Love that. The second one was, are there certain questions or practices that you go through to do some of that self-interrogation, so cultivate that awareness around your emotions and how you're processing things? Are there any particular questions or practices that come to mind?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think, in my learning, I came across that often we kind of stick to, say, 8 emotions, right? We get into the habit of saying angry, sad, happy, disappointed. So first it was for me just really like, well, what does it look like, feel like, sound like when I'm angry? What does it look like, feel like, sound like when I'm sad? What does it look like, feel like, sound like when I'm joyful? When I'm disappointed. And I think that allowed for me to deepen my awareness of where that might show up for me in my personal life. And of course, building our own emotional awareness and emotional intelligence then allows for us to be better empathetic humans for those around us. And we can begin to notice that there might be some similarities to emotions that they are perhaps expressing, maybe not even with awareness that they are expressing. And Also, I think it's this constant posture of curiosity and really slowing down and taking time to give myself space to identify how I'm feeling in a particular circumstance. You know, in the world of education, and many jobs can be like this, it's so frantic and so fast paced that we really can't ever absorb what it is that we are truly encountering and feeling, because it's such a rapid fire movement from one task to the next. And we experienced this a little bit in the pandemic when life suddenly came to a halt. We had all of a sudden all this time and space, and it was an opportunity to pay attention and notice what was coming up, right? Even those uncomfortable feelings of overwhelm or anxiety or discomfort. And I think if I've learned anything, it's to rewrite that narrative that the uncomfortable is not necessarily bad, it's just uncomfortable. And I think that's a narrative that's really driven hard uh, in society at times, is uncomfortable equals bad. When really uncomfortable can be exactly where we need to be so that we can grow and stretch as individuals, right? For any of us who have ever had the encounter of traveling abroad or sitting across from another individual who speaks a different language, there's a lot of awkwardness when we first start conversing and we're stumbling through conversation. It can feel uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that that's a human that's bad, or that's a relationship that's bad, or that's something that we need to move away from. So again, that posture of curiosity, really sitting with what is, really asking, like, what is coming up for me? How do I want to respond? Do I need to respond? Um, yeah, I think I'll pause there. I could probably keep.
Yeah, no, that's great. Oh, that's so wonderful. Oh, yeah, no, I could listen to you for a lot longer than we have tonight. Finally, I just wanted to, your cute book is sitting right there. So
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit about the book and where people can get it if it's something they're interested in?
Yeah. So I this is another experience and opportunity I feel so fortunate about. I was given the opportunity to write a book directed towards educators, and that's a very broad term for me, right? For many of us, we might think an educator is someone in a brick and mortar building in a classroom, but really over the past year, I think almost all of us have become educators in one way or another. So the book, Don't Just Survive, Thrive, is written for educators to foster resiliency and prevent burnout. And it's broken into three parts. The first part addresses the state of education. We know that teaching is a demanding job, educating is a demanding job, and that has an impact with the very little people that we are really trying to make a difference with in the world. And the second part is sharing some of what I offered here tonight, which is, the ripple effect and impact of stress and trauma in our personal lives, and how when we are disconnected from how that shows up, it starts to seep over and out into the people that we care a lot for. And so finally, this response of being resilient, fostering resilience, really taking on postures that help build your capacity to move through the demands of the job or life. So the book is published by Ulysses Press, and it's available anywhere where you can find books, whether that's your favorite independent bookstore or Barnes and Noble or Amazon. For any of you that are local, you can also contact me personally. And if you want a signed copy, you can reach
Mhm.
out to me personally. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, SaraJane. Thanks again for spending time with us this evening, for sharing your wisdom and your expertise. It's just such a gift to sit with someone that has spent so much time working through these things that we've all been engaging with over the past year, but it also a little bit feels like, oh, we've got a whole new vocabulary of buzzwords, and have we
Yes.
actually interrogated what any of that means?
Yes.
So thank you for walking us through a lot of that. It's just been such a gift. And thank you so much to all of our guests that joined us this evening, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook. It's so good to have you here with us. And thank you for engaging in these conversations with us. And we hope that you'll join us again next week. We're back at the noon hour next Monday with Shadia, who is one of the team members here at Treetops. And lastly, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that we're doing a celebration of women entrepreneurs on March 31st. So I'm putting the link in the chat, and you can get registered for that as well. Finally, if you're new to Treetops Collective and want to learn more, you can find us at treetopscollective.org. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks again, SaraJane, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you all.